December 19, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow fell in thick, suffocating curtains across the frozen pines, muffling the thunder of panzer engines as they clawed through mud and ice. Oberstleutnant Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper stood beside his command vehicle, breath clouding in the bitter air, watching his mechanized column grind to a halt once more. Fuel gauges hovered near empty. Around him, the finest warriors of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard Adolf Hitler sat idle, their Tiger tanks reduced to steel monuments in the snow. Peiper's gloved hand tightened around a canteen of ersatz coffee, bitter, made from acorns and chicory, as he stared down the forest road. Somewhere ahead, through the white chaos, lay the American fuel depot at Stavelot. 50,000 gallons, his reconnaissance reported. Enough to push his spearhead to the Meuse River, perhaps even to Antwerp. Enough to change the war. He did not yet know that what awaited him in those American supply dumps would do more than fuel his tanks. It would shatter an illusion. The Ardennes offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, was Adolf Hitler's desperate gamble to reverse the tide of inevitable defeat. By late 1944, Germany was a nation bleeding from 1,000 wounds. The Eastern Front consumed armies whole. The Western Allies pressed relentlessly from Normandy. German cities burned under unending aerial bombardment. Oil refineries in Romania lay in ruins. Synthetic fuel plants across the Reich produced only a fraction of what the war machine demanded. Panzer divisions sat paralyzed not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. Luftwaffe fighters gathered dust in hangars, while Allied bombers darkened the skies with impunity. Hitler's solution was audacious to the point of madness. Strike through the Ardennes, split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West before turning full strength against the Soviets. For this final roll of the dice, Hitler scraped together every reserve, every liter of precious fuel. The plan demanded speed, surprise, and above all, the capture of American fuel supplies along the way. German planners knew their logistics could not sustain a prolonged offensive. They would have to live off captured enemy stocks, a strategy born not of cunning, but of desperation. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, the armored spearhead of the offensive, carried just enough fuel to reach the Meuse if everything went perfectly. But war is never perfect. Roads clogged with refugees and destroyed American columns. Bridges blown before they could be seized. And always the fuel gauges falling. Peiper was a hard man shaped by hard years. A true believer in National Socialist ideals, he had fought across Poland, France, and the endless Russian steppes. He expected his enemy to be formidable in combat, but brittle in resolve, the Americans especially. Nazi propaganda painted them as soft, individualistic, obsessed with comfort and luxury, incapable of the ideological discipline that forged the German soldier. They were mongrels, the propaganda said, a nation of capitalists and cowards held together only by material wealth. Strip away their machines and abundance, and they would crumble. Peiper believed this, or wanted to believe it. His own men survived on black bread and turnip soup, their uniforms patched, their boots worn through. They fought not because they were comfortable, but because they were hard. Because they believed. On the morning of December 18th, Kampfgruppe Peiper had broken through American lines near Hansfeld, overrunning convoys and capturing small fuel stocks, enough to keep moving, but never enough. The American soldiers they encountered fought with surprising tenacity, but also with something that troubled Peiper. They seemed genuinely shocked to be retreating, as if the very concept of defeat was alien to them. When captured, they did not have the hollow-eyed look of men long acquainted with deprivation. They looked healthy, well-fed. Their uniforms were new, their equipment abundant. One young GI, barely old enough to shave, carried chocolate bars in his pocket. Chocolate. In December 1944. In the middle of a war. Peiper pushed the thought aside. His objective was fuel, and fuel lay ahead at Stavelot. The town of Stavelot clung to the banks of the Amblève River, a medieval crossroads, now choked with American supply vehicles fleeing west. Peiper's tanks arrived late on December 18th, seizing a bridge before American engineers could destroy it. Resistance was fierce but disorganized. By dawn on the 19th, advance elements of Kampfgruppe Peiper pushed into the town's outskirts and discovered what their scouts had reported, an American fuel depot, vast and sprawling, jerry cans and fuel trucks stacked in rows that seemed to stretch to the horizon. 50,000 gallons. Perhaps more. Enough to fuel an entire panzer corps for days. But as Peiper's men secured the depot, something else became impossible to ignore. The sheer scale of American logistics defied comprehension. This was not a carefully rationed strategic reserve. This was abundance. Fuel drums marked for training purposes only sat alongside combat stocks. Trucks lined up with spare tires, spare parts, spare everything. Nearby supply dumps overflowed with rations, canned meat, coffee, real coffee, cigarettes by the carton, chocolate bars, powdered milk, even holiday packages from home. One German soldier pried open a crate expecting ammunition and found candy canes. Candy canes, striped red and white, meant for Christmas, sent across an ocean to men fighting in a foreign forest. Peiper walked through the depot in silence. His face, weathered by years of command, betrayed nothing. But his mind worked furiously. He had spent the last year watching Germany's war effort suffocate under scarcity. Every liter of fuel accounted for. Every bullet rationed. His own division's panzer tanks often sat idle waiting for fuel that never came. The Luftwaffe had all but vanished from the skies, not from cowardice, but because there was no fuel to fly. German soldiers marched in boots with soles made from wood and paper. They ate bread mixed with sawdust. And here, in this single American depot in a backwater Belgian town, sat more fuel than his entire Kampfgruppe had consumed in a month. And this was just one depot. One. An aide approached with a clipboard, inventorying the captured stocks. Herr Oberstleutnant, we have confirmed at least 50,000 gallons of fuel, multiple grades. Also captured, 14 trucks in working condition, spare parts, lubricants, and rations for approximately 2,000 men for 1 week. The aide hesitated, then added, there are also personal items. Luxury goods. The Americans were distributing them to troops. Peiper took the clipboard but did not look at it. His gaze fixed on a stack of fuel drums bearing the white star of the U.S. Army. Each drum identical, each filled without scarcity's shadow hanging over it. How far to the Meuse? He asked quietly. 40 kilometers, Herr Oberstleutnant. With this fuel easily within reach. Peiper nodded slowly, but his thoughts had already moved beyond tactical calculations. Something profound and terrible was settling over him, a realization that no amount of courage or ideology could suppress. Germany was not losing this war because her soldiers lacked will. They were losing because they were fighting an enemy that could afford to ship candy canes across an ocean in the middle of a total war. An enemy whose supply depots in rear areas held more fuel than the Wehrmacht's strategic reserves. An enemy whose soldiers carried chocolate in their pockets as casually as German soldiers carried identification discs. He had fought the Soviets, who threw men into battle in human waves, whose soldiers shared rifles and charged German machine guns with suicidal courage. He had fought the British, who endured bombings and shortages with grim resolve. But the Americans waged war as if scarcity itself did not exist, as if the very concept of rationing was alien to their national character. They fought not from desperation, but from surplus. Their industrial capacity was so vast that they could afford waste. Entire depots, left behind in retreat, abandoned not because they had to be, but because there were more where those came from. Peiper's hand drifted to the canteen at his belt, acorn coffee, lukewarm and bitter. He thought of his men, hard men, good soldiers, fighting for years on dwindling supplies. He thought of the factories back in the Reich, bombed daily, struggling to produce enough bullets and shells. He thought of the synthetic fuel plants that could never meet demand, the rubber made from dandelions, the steel alloys weakened by lack of proper materials. Germany had been at total war for 5 years, every resource bent toward victory. And here was America, barely 3 years in the fight, shipping holiday decorations to the front lines. One of Peiper's tank commanders approached, a veteran named Diefenthal, grinning beneath a face black with soot and exhaustion. Herr Oberstleutnant, we can refuel the entire column. We can reach the Meuse. We can. Yes, Peiper interrupted quietly. We can. He paused, watching German soldiers haul American fuel drums toward idling panzer tanks. And then... Diefenthal blinked, not understanding. After the Meuse, Peiper continued, his voice barely above a murmur. What then? We capture Antwerp. And then? Do you think the Americans will run out of fuel? Do you think they will run out of tanks or bullets or chocolate bars? Diefenthal's grin faded. He said nothing. Peiper turned away. Refuel the column. We move within the hour. But the poison of understanding had already entered his mind, and it would not leave. The Ardennes offensive, for all its initial shock and violence, was doomed before it began. German planners had expected weak American resistance, rapid advances, and the seizure of Allied fuel supplies. What they encountered instead was an enemy capable of flooding the front with reinforcements and material at a pace Germany could never match. Within days, American forces stabilized the line. Within a week, the weather cleared, and Allied air power descended like a hammer. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, even with captured fuel, found itself surrounded near the town of Gleize by December 24th. Unable to advance, unable to retreat with his vehicles, Peiper ordered his men to destroy their tanks and escape on foot through the frozen forest. Of the 50,000 gallons captured at Stavelot, not a drop would reach the Meuse. But numbers alone do not tell the story. The captured fuel itself became a symbol seared into the memory of every German soldier who saw it. They had been told that the Allies were stretched thin, that one more push would break them. What they found instead was an enemy so rich in resources that even their rear area supply dumps held more war material than Germany's frontline reserves. Letters and diaries from German soldiers during the Battle of the Bulge reveal a recurring theme: astonishment at American abundance. One soldier wrote home describing American rations he had captured. "They eat better in their trenches than we do in garrison. How can we win against this?" Another, an SS Hauptsturmführer, recorded in his journal, "We captured an American supply convoy. I expected weapons, perhaps food. What I found were 10 crates of Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola. In the middle of winter, in the middle of a war. I stood there holding a bottle and understood for the first time that we are not fighting an army. We are fighting an economy. And we have already lost." Peiper himself, in testimony after the war, reflected on that December week with a clarity born of hindsight. "We were soldiers fighting with the resources of a bankrupt state. They were soldiers backed by an inexhaustible treasury. Courage, discipline, tactical brilliance, none of it mattered in the end. You cannot defeat arithmetic." The 50,000 gallons at Stavelot represented more than fuel. It represented the fundamental asymmetry of the Second World War's final year. Germany, for all its military skill and ideological fervor, was a mid-sized industrial nation attempting to fight the combined weight of 3 global empires: the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States. Of these, the United States was the most terrifying precisely because it waged war almost casually, with a fraction of its population in uniform, and its homeland untouched by bombing. American factories produced tanks, planes, and ships at rates that seemed physically impossible. In 1944 alone, the United States produced more than 96,000 aircraft. Germany, straining every sinew of its war economy, produced just over 40,000. American shipyards launched a new merchant vessel every day. American farms fed not only their own soldiers but supplied Britain and the Soviet Union as well. And it was this abundance, not superior tactics, not ideology, but sheer material wealth, that broke the Wehrmacht's back. Peiper's canteen of acorn coffee became, in his mind, the perfect emblem of the war's true nature. Germany fought on ersatz substitutes: coffee made from roasted acorns, rubber made from dandelions, oil synthesized from coal. Every substitute a confession of scarcity. Meanwhile, American soldiers in Belgian forests drank real coffee, ate chocolate, and left behind candy canes because they could afford to. The ersatz coffee was bitter, gritty, unsatisfying, but it was all Germany had. The Americans drank the real thing and thought nothing of it. After the war, Peiper stood trial for war crimes. His unit had been implicated in the massacre of American prisoners at Malmedy during the Ardennes offensive. He was convicted and imprisoned, eventually released in the 1950s. He lived quietly in France until his assassination in 1976, likely by former French resistance members. But in interviews during his imprisonment, Peiper returned again and again to that moment in Stavelot, to the fuel depot, to the realization that settled over him like snow falling on frozen ground. Years later, a historian interviewing Peiper asked what he thought when he saw the depot at Stavelot. Peiper was silent for a long moment, then said, "I thought of my mother. She wrote to me in November 1944, saying she had received her ration of coffee for the month, 200 grams. Ersatz, of course. Roasted barley. She tried to make it sound cheerful, like it was a small victory. 200 grams for a month. And there in Stavelot were American soldiers with real coffee, as much as they wanted, shipped from across the world. I realized then that my mother and everyone like her had sacrificed everything for a cause that was already lost, not because we lacked courage, but because we lacked everything else." The Battle of the Bulge ended in late January 1945, with German forces pushed back to their starting positions. Over 100,000 German casualties, thousands of vehicles destroyed or abandoned, irreplaceable fuel expended for no strategic gain. The Ardennes offensive broke the Wehrmacht's last reserves and opened the road to the Rhine. Within 4 months, Berlin would fall. But the 50,000 gallons at Stavelot had already delivered their verdict. In the history of warfare, logistics is destiny. Amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics, the old maxim goes. The Second World War proved it beyond doubt. German tactical brilliance, blitzkrieg, combined arms warfare, superior tank design, meant nothing when tanks sat immobile for lack of fuel. Luftwaffe pilots, among the best trained in the world, could not fight without aviation gasoline. Infantry divisions could not maneuver without trucks, and trucks could not run on ideology. The Americans understood this instinctively. Their military doctrine emphasized supply lines, redundancy, overwhelming material superiority. They planned for waste. They oversupplied as a matter of course. Where Germans calculated precisely how much fuel was needed, and then struggled to deliver it, Americans estimated how much was needed, and then delivered twice that amount just in case. This was not inefficiency. It was the luxury of abundance, and it was decisive. Peiper's canteen of acorn coffee and the American soldiers' chocolate bars were not trivial details. They were microcosms of the war itself. One side fought on substitutes and scarcity, the other on surplus and plenty. One side demanded fanatical belief to compensate for material weakness, the other relied on material strength and asked only for competence. The outcome was never in doubt, though it took millions of lives and years of suffering to reach the inevitable conclusion. In the end, Peiper survived the war, stood trial, and lived into old age, long enough to see Germany rebuilt by American aid, long enough to see former enemies become allies, long enough to watch the Cold War reshape the world. He never recanted his beliefs, never fully renounced the ideology he had served. But in private moments, in interviews with historians, the memory of Stavelot returned. 50,000 gallons, candy canes, real coffee, chocolate bars in the pockets of farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit who had crossed an ocean to fight in forest they had never heard of, supplied so abundantly that they could afford to leave luxuries behind. We were doomed the moment America entered the war, Peiper admitted once, near the end of his life. Not because of their soldiers, though they learned to fight well enough, but because they had everything and we had nothing. They could lose 10 battles and come back for an 11th. We could win 10 battles and still lose the war. I saw that at Stavelot. I knew it then. And I kept fighting anyway, because what else was there to do? But I knew. The fuel depot at Stavelot no longer exists. The town was rebuilt after the war, its scars healed by time. But the moment remains, frozen in memory and record, a German colonel standing among captured American supplies, holding a canteen of ersatz coffee, and seeing with perfect clarity the shape of defeat. Not defeat in battle, but defeat in arithmetic. Defeat in industrial capacity. Defeat in the cold mathematics of production and supply. Germany had asked her people to sacrifice everything, and they had. But sacrifice alone does not win wars. Belief alone does not conjure fuel from empty tanks. Courage alone does not feed armies or arm divisions. The Americans had not sacrificed more, they had produced more. They had not believed harder, they had built more factories, drilled more oil wells, planted more fields. And in the end, that was enough. Peiper's realization at Stavelot was the same realization that came to thousands of German soldiers in the war's final year. They were not fighting enemies, they were fighting economies. And no amount of valor could bridge that gap. The 50,000 gallons of fuel became a story told in prisoner of war camps, repeated in whispers among German veterans after the war. It became a symbol of the moment when ideological certainty met material reality and shattered. The story spread not because it was unique. Similar revelations occurred across the front, but because it was universal. Every German soldier who saw American supply operations felt the same cold shock of understanding. And perhaps that is the deepest irony. The Nazi regime built its ideology on the myth of willpower overcoming material conditions, of spiritual strength transcending physical weakness. The triumph of the will. The cult of hardness and sacrifice. Yet the war they unleashed was decided not by will, but by production. Not by spirit, but by steel, oil, and wheat. Not by belief, but by shipping tonnage and factory output. The very things they dismissed as decadent bourgeois concerns, economics, logistics, supply chains, proved to be the sinews of victory. Peiper stood at Stavelot and saw his worldview collapse, though he could not yet name it. The acorn coffee in his hand was not just a drink, it was a confession. Germany had nothing left to give. The ersatz substitutes, the scavenged materials, the synthetic fuels, all of it was the desperate improvisation of a nation that had overreached and now paid the price. And across from him, vast and inexhaustible, stood an enemy that waged war almost as an afterthought, that could afford luxury in the middle of carnage, that shipped candy canes to the Ardennes, because why not? In the end, the fuel was captured and then lost, the tanks destroyed, the offensive blunted. But the knowledge remained. 50,000 gallons had revealed a truth more devastating than any artillery barrage. Germany was fighting a war it could not win, against an enemy it could not outlast, for a cause already drowned in the bottomless plenty of American industry. And somewhere in the frozen Ardennes, a canteen of acorn coffee grew cold in a German colonel's hand, bitter to the last drop.